All right, so welcome everybody to an episode of Book and Spade as I, your host, John Evans, and my good friend Matt Lewis here begin to discuss the mysteries of the incarnation of Jesus, of God becoming a human being, which is at the center of our Christian faith. And our discussions today, which we are recording shortly before the Feast of Christmas, we're hoping to get this uploaded before the coming of the feast to discuss these mysteries. We'll plumb many depths, many topics that come to mind. The Christmas story is something which I think we all think we know a little bit something about from Hallmark cards or movies like The Little Drummer Boy, The Nativity, or anything else. But the reality is, as we've discussed elsewhere in the channel and on recent videos, the truth is far more powerful and palpable when we get behind the stained glass icon to the lives of real historical people and the way they faced the reality of the virgin birth, the arrival of the creator of the universe, born in a stable. So, Matt, any questions or ideas or thoughts that have been arising in your heart as you've been preparing for the Christmas season, as we've been meditating on the familiar narratives of Luke chapter 1 and 2 and Matthew chapters 1 and 2 as well?
I mostly have been thinking about this as just an experiential on an experiential level. Oftentimes when I went to church as a kid, we often heard the sermon, "We must not forget," what Christmas is all about, right? And I've, thought about that in my adulthood as we're rustling and bustling through the day and we're forgetting, so many things. We're so focused on this sort of survival mindset. Um, Christmas is sometimes very difficult for a lot of people. And the way that I often like to return to remember what Christmas is all about is sometimes through Christmas movies, returning back to tradition. There are a lot of beautiful Christmas movies. Some of them are claymation, some of them are live action. But there's also some Christmas movies that also seem to also miss the point too. Some that don't miss the point to me, are like The Little Drummer Boy. There's a lot of great films that really do capture some of the majesty of the moment. Um, so when I think about this season of Advent, I think a little bit about kind of getting swept up in the Christmas spirit through media, through film, through those kinds of tools. What about you?
Yeah, I'm curious to get your take on it. As the massive J.R.R. Tolkien, author of the Lord of the Rings, and C.S. Lewis, author of the Chronicles of Narnia fan on this end, do you remember a certain rather palpable role Christmas played in Narnia? Do you
Hmm.
remember the
I believe Father Christmas is actually a character in the Chronicles of Narnia.
Yes, he is. Do you remember any other details about Father Christmas and what he gives to the children?
I believe he gives gifts, sort of tools, similar to like Galadriel in Tolkien.
In fact, he says, "These are tools, not toys."
Hmm.
And of course, he gives the weapons, right? He gives the sword to Peter. I believe, I'm going from memory here. Book fans can correct me in the comments. I believe he gives a bow to Susan. And I'm pretty sure he gives a dagger to someone else. It might have been Lucy at that point, along with, I think, a small vial of a kind of elixir that offers re-energizing. But do you remember why Father Christmas is such a stunning character who shows up?
Well, I think it's because I might be wrong. This was my reading.
Yeah.
But, he's sort of this transcendent figure. He exists in Narnia and also in the overworld. Who knows? What do you think?
Well, it's curious, right? The White Witch of Narnia is the villain of this world. She is a personification of malevolence. She is a kind of female Hasatan figure, a kind of female embodiment of the antithesis of Aslan in the text. Although Aslan is the creator and she would only be a creature, so I should specify what I really mean by antithesis. But she has made it so that it is always winter, but never Christmas. She has made it so that it is always winter and never Christmas. the arrival of Father Christmas is a sign that the reign of this always winterland is actually coming to an end. Now, historically, that's actually not so far off the mark from what has happened. My beloved wife, Samantha, her family roots go back to those who came over on the Mayflower, and it's beautiful having those family heritage points. And yet, when the Pilgrim Fathers landed on, Plymouth Rock and established their settlement, well, a lot of people know as Puritans, they had such a sola scriptura interpretation, such a maybe excessive reading of the Bible alone, to the rejection of all traditions, that for them, Christmas was considered blasphemous. The Puritans, the heroes of some retellings of that story, I know lately there's been pushback on who they were and what they did. I think that they were complicated but heroic people, as we are complicated people capable of great heroism. That a lot of these brave souls, for them, because they couldn't find December the 25th in their Bibles, because they couldn't find the idea of decking the halls with celebrations in those kinds of ways, they did not celebrate Christmas. Instead, they had the feast in late November or early November to celebrate the harvest, which became their Thanksgiving. And the word Eucharist, of course, in Greek means Thanksgiving.
Mm-hmm.
So the thing is, Christmas was illegal at one point in England because of the rise of Puritans, like the figure Oliver Cromwell, of unhappy memory on Irish circles, given my ancestry, and perhaps of happy memory for more parliamentary voices in England. The Soviet Union, right? Not from Christians, from supposedly secular atheists. They try really to outlaw Christmas. So the ultimate idea of always winter, never Christmas has been a historical feature, no matter what we think of the culture war today and how that kind of is personified. And what's curious about that narrative is Father Christmas as a kind of character from the overworld and from the underworld. Well, not the underworld, the Narnian world, the hidden world, right? Father Christmas bridges those realities, because there is no figure named Christ in Narnia, is there? You have Aslan, who is a Christ figure, but Jesus himself is not himself named in that world. So he kind of shows the interconnected tissue of this interdimensional reality. So does that strike a chord with any idea of expectation that the empire of darkness is being broken? Or does that offer any surprising leitmotifs to your imagination?
Well, what I love about this time of year is when we read scripture, we get to look at it through the lens of, well, here is God being smuggled behind enemy lines.
C.S. Lewis again, yeah.
Right? This is an incredible undertaking. And the means by which God enters his own creation are absolutely magnificent. It's, I am really love this time of year when meditating on our Blessed Mother Mary, and Saint Joseph. I mean, he's a saint. He is a figure that I meditate on often. Doesn't have a single line in the Bible, right? And yet is such an important part of this, time of year to meditate on, in my opinion. It is interesting. We were talking about how there's just so much embedded in the teachings of the wise men, and how in many ways they are also their quest sort of seems like something out of a fantasy novel as well, very similar to Narnia. Is there anything else that you think is worth meditating or looking to in scripture during this time as we sort of enter this last week leading up into Christmas?
Well, in the manger. I mean, what is a manger, if we think about it? It's a feeding trough for animals. What does the word Bethlehem mean in Hebrew? Beit Lachem, house of bread. Jesus becomes our bread.
Mm-hmm.
There is a rabbinical tradition describing the role of shepherds and the way they are seen. Shepherds look after lambs. Jesus is dressed in swaddling clothes, kind of like a lamb placed in that feeding trough. Behold the Lamb of God, behold him who takes away the sins of the world. Blessed are we who are called to the wedding supper of the Lamb. When we come to Christmas, we should discover how God in his humility becomes not only an infant, he becomes our food. He becomes lachem in Hebrew, bread to be broken. A life offered so that he could die. Something that we miss. It's curious. We often have a kind of fairy tale attachments in light of Hallmark and cartoons. The Bible describes a frightened young girl who could have been stoned. Now, I believe that, as, by the way, Martin Luther apparently believed as well, that Mary is the Immaculate Conception. She's conceived without original sin. Luther believed that, by the way, in the 1520s and 30s, even with his break from Rome. I would encourage people to look at it. It's not simply a Roman Catholic dogma. And the ELCA and other Lutheran bodies, of course, it is of a private conscience. We don't bind anyone's conscience to any belief. In fact, I'm pointing out something 98% of Lutherans don't know, and most Protestants generally wouldn't know. What's clear, though, is even if you believe, as I do, that Mary is conceived without sin and has no sin, she's still frightened. She still doesn't know all the answers at once. Even if she has revelations and visions, and I believe she does know when you fear more, actually. And yet she still chooses to follow God. She says yes. Same thing with Joseph. To love your wife, so much so that you are willing to raise God. Remember, they lose Jesus in the temple later. It's one thing to lose your own child. Imagine losing the creator of the universe. And that would be pressure-filled. That'd be rather pressure-filled, for sure. I mean, it's a real... I'm trying to point out the reality of the story here. I mean, you have the infants slaughtered and toddlers slaughtered in Bethlehem by a tyrannical king. You have a family escaping as refugees into a foreign land. You have the census of a real emperor, Caesar Augustus. The fact that we in the modern world struggle with angels and demons is our problem. I consider them more real than the sun, the stars, and the moon. They've been here for far longer than them. So they've been around longer before the first couple, Adam and Eve, as well. So it's the reality of the story that grips me. It's applicable. It's true. It's historical. But it's also applicable to all times and all places. December the 24th used to be the feasts of Adam and of Eve in the Western calendar. And I believe it was Germans who would take a tree into their homes and they would carry out a medieval mystery play, I think, in the early centuries of the church, reenacting the fall of humanity, so that on deck 25, there was the idea that Mary's yes, the birth of this child, brings forth the undoing of the fall, the undoing of the no of Eve through the yes of Mary. What does that mean for our own yes? How does that relate to our own yes? Anything resonate there with you? Or any tangents it opens, any doors it opens to other corridors?
Mm-hmm.
Because for me, that's an ocean I swim in, if not daily, at least weekly.
Well, there's two things I want to touch upon. My wife and I just watched the movie HERETIC that just came out. And there's this one, I actually thought the movie was fascinating, and it was a good horror film for people who are theologically minded or even curious. It's fun. But at the same time, there are lots of arguments brought up saying that not just Christianity, but all Abrahamic religions are false religions, and that there is a true religion beneath all of them. I would say that ultimate idea was ultimately a letdown in the film, but nonetheless, it was a fun horrific ride. There is this one moment in the film where Hugh Grant's character, a very, let's say evil man, in the film, he makes this proposition, which is that through the iteration of ancient myths, we end up with many messianic characters, people, mythical characters throughout time who are born of a virgin and also born on December the 25th. If we're talking about the Annunciation and we're talking about December the 25th and we're celebrating it today, is this just the latest iteration of all of these older myths that have had terrible PR?
Where do I begin? I always find this question to be popular on Reddit circles, if Reddit is even still a thing. It was popular about 5 or 6 years ago on Reddit. I love how Lutheran Satire, a YouTube channel I recommend, really just destroys these arguments pretty clearly. The Annunciation, I just want to offer, not a correction, but just clarification. The Annunciation is when Jesus is conceived. Christmas, of course, the Nativity is when Jesus is born. So you have to track 9 months earlier. And that gets you to March the 25th, if you take Dec 25 as a legitimate date. March the 25th. Let me see. As a Lord of the Rings nerd, Matt, do you remember what happens on March the 25th? Think the end of the Return of the King. Something.
Well, isn't that when the ring is dropped in Mount Doom?
Correct.
Yes, right.
So, once again, I can say this on this YouTube channel in transparency. I would pastorally walk with people where they are at and love them where they are at. J.R.R. Tolkien just gave his stamp to where he believes life begins, not at birth, at conception. J.R.R. Tolkien has made a powerful argument about how the conception of Jesus, the virginal divine conception of Jesus, is really the destruction of evil. Yes, the birth. Yes, the crucifixion. Yes, the death. Yes, the resurrection. Yes, the ascension. Yes, the real presence in the Eucharist. But at the conception, the God of eternity, the Lord before all time, crucified before the foundations of the world, according to Revelation, becomes a human being in that yes. Let's say for a moment, and by the way, it is a false historical argument to make the outrageous claim that you have multiple virgin births on Dec 25. We're going to go into that. I promise we are. Let's assume for a moment that trifle was true for a moment. Tolkien would have argued that all myths, all world cultures are yearning, are pressing towards the true myth, the word becoming flesh in time. I don't mean to be offensive to my neo-pagan friends, but I have to speak the truth as I see it. I really cannot find good evidence that Osiris ever walked the earth. I don't have good evidence that the Babylonian god Marduk was a real man. I have Roman extra-biblical sources, early Aramaic creeds, epistles written within the lifetime of eyewitnesses of the historical Jesus, all attesting to the life of this real man claiming to be God. And not a God as the movie Heretic implies, on the basis of power, domination, control, and submission. But a God who so becomes vulnerable, he is willing to be born in order that he might die in exchange for us. There's a beautiful Orthodox, Russian Orthodox hymn I love. It's a part of the Easter liturgy. The chorus goes something like, Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and to those in the tombs he is bestowing life. Trampling down death by death. Not becoming a master, but by becoming deliberately the servant of all, literally in the Greek, the slave of all.
Mm-hmm.
That is not the same as the other virgin-birthed gods. It's also the distinction between the God of the universe, becoming a baby, versus a lowercase g God's spirit becoming a baby. And when they enter into the world in the ancient cosmology, when Alexander the Great claims that he is born of Zeus and his mother, and she was certainly no virgin before that, it's very clear that Alexander wants to conquer the world with the edge of a sword. Jesus conquers the world through the cross. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do. My God, why hast thou abandoned me? Entering into our pain, our suffering, and our vindication on the cross. Let's get down to the historical dates for a moment. The myth that Christmas is a copy-paste from other pagan religions is historically a innovative idea. It's not one that has been traditionally held. There is, of course, the pagan feast of Saturnalia that occurs earlier in December, but does not end on Dec 25, because Dec 25 is not the winter solstice. There was the feast of the incomparable sun, Sol Invictus, around December the 25th, but its earliest attestation, I believe, is 3rd century, maybe 2nd. Well over the period of time after the celebration of Christmas. You don't have the idea of many virgin birthed gods per se, because, well, those virgin births are not really all that virginal. I don't want to, God forbid, children are looking at this YouTube channel for any reason. I don't want to get into the details, but let's just say the participation of the women in those narratives were usually far less consensual in those pagan myths. The gods largely did what they pleased with human beings. Mary has an option and Mary has a choice. Mary can say no.
Mm-hmm.
Mary easily can say no. And she is invited to fulfill the role of becoming the mother of God. Her yes is not the yes of, please dominate me, O Lord of the universe. Her yes is also not, please become human through me so you could kill all the evil Romans crucifying my people. And she would, I believe Mary was conceived without sin. So for me personally, and for Martin Luther personally, by the way, Mary certainly is not thinking in those vengeful ways. But try to put it in our perspective. Any one of us would have been angry. Any one of us would have been upset with the oppression of her people. Justice now, right? And yet, she wants God to become a human being through her so that there could be the reconciliation of all humanity.
Mm-hmm.
This is why at the cross, Jesus says, woman, behold your son behold your mother. It radically reinterprets what power is. So no, the idea of copying and pasting from other world myths is not what's going on with December the 25th. But it is the fulfillment of the desire in all those myths for divinity to touch down, divinity to become human, divinity to be accessible. Do you find anything lacking in that response, or things you want to tug on more, or does that open a window into another reality?
I want to pitch an idea.
Yeah.
Let me turn a little bit of light on in this room, and then let me pitch that idea. So the thread I guess I wanted to pull is, throughout the Old Testament, we have a lot of foreshadowing, even before John the Baptist. And there are many moments where we get this image of Christ coming. And I wanted to ask if you think any of these pagan myths, ancient myths that are similar in archetype, although some of these are of polytheistic traditions, right? If any of these imprints or archetypes, do they ring as sort of fractals or foreshadowing of the coming Christ, or are these in a completely different genre of their own? The reason why I mentioned fractals is because there's an often rhyming that happens throughout history. And if you look throughout ancient myths, you see a lot of this rhyming happen as humankind deciphers or attempts to decipher meaning from the transcendent. And that rhyming, I like to see, I like to call it a fractal because it almost persists and spirals into an almost embedded truth within our reality. Did I lose you with that question? What do you think?
No. I mean, you know you're echoing Tolkien, or do you know that you're echoing Tolkien?
I do know I'm echoing Tolkien here, yes.
Because what's interesting is Tolkien really believed that all world myths, particularly the Norse myths, like I think Balor, he rises from the dead of some kind or dies a kind of redemptive death. It's been a while since I re-examined Norse mythology, I freely admit. I've had my nose in the New Testament given my studies ministerially. He believes all these myths point to Jesus. It isn't as if God abandoned all people but ancient Israel. It's not as if God stopped talking to people. God speaks through art and music. It would be a shame to say that God didn't talk through Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. That God didn't speak through this, in some sense, the beauty of art, the wrestling found in Homer. The fact of the matter remains that all world cultures were yearning. There's even a prophecy, supposedly, I want to say this supposedly, of a child leaning on the lap of a young woman or virgin found in the writings of Virgil, the author of the Aeneid, just bringing about a new age of peace. People say he meant to say that about the coming of a Roman emperor, but who's to say that two things can't be equally true, that what Virgil meant to be an echo of an earthly emperor was actually the coming of a divine emperor, or rather the divine emperor among us. The Romans certainly thought of their emperors as being filled with a divine genius. And so it is that when I see these myths, they hunger. The myths themselves hunger for fulfillment. Are you aware of the play Hadestown?
I'm not aware of that. No.
Yeah, I found about it through my good friend Stephanie, and it's a play. It's a Broadway play that's been out for a long time, that through folk music tries to retell the tale of what is his name? It's a young man who is madly in love with a woman. Eurydice, I believe, is her name. And after they've become betrothed, and in the musical, the man has the capability of creating a song that will resurrect the earth after a kind of perpetual winter yet again. This young woman, Eurydice, is seduced into signing a kind of satanic contract with Hades, the god of the underworld. She dies, and her soul is held in ransom to the god of the underworld. So our hero must travel down into the underworld to rescue his love. And when he gets down there, he's even contemplating a mutiny against the god of the underworld, against Hades. And he nearly succeeds, but in the myth and in the play, just as he is about to leave the underworld, he does the one thing he made a deal with Hades not to do. Do you remember from maybe high school or middle school when we first heard the myth? Do you remember what he does?
I do not know.
He looks behind. He looks at her. He's not supposed to look at her as he's leading her back to the surface world. And the play ends with everybody offering a toast, honoring this great poet, this great musician. You know why I love and hate this musical? On one hand, it's right that humanity was, through our disobedience, ransomed or locked in a negative relationship with darkness, with the Lord of the underworld. And it's true that we in our state had the possibility of becoming the ones through whom God would bring the springtime to a world in perpetual spiritualized winter. And yet, our Messiah, our Lord, our Savior, Jesus Christ, did not enter into our underworld only to botch it up, to mess it up, in a sense. No wonder the protagonist of this musical, this Broadway masterpiece, it's awesome, the music is great, by the way. No wonder he fails, because all of us have failed. It takes one without original sin. It takes the creator of the universe truly to do that. Hence the unique need for the coming of a Messiah. That's a pagan myth. You ask for pagan myths that yearn for Jesus. I think that's one of them. And it admits that of their own system, they cannot see the way out, but they crave a way out. And there's wisdom. There's wisdom that sings there. Take the Iliad. Do you remember watching the movie Troy?
Of course.
Do you remember Brad Pitt's character, Achilles?
Yes, yes.
And do you remember why he's so angry throughout the film?
Oh, remind me. It's been a while.
So he is in love with a slave girl.
Mm-hmm.
This slave girl is stolen by the king, Agamemnon, commander of the Greek forces. You know, in the Hollywood movie, they make that the relationship with this slave girl kind of a romance. She's actually a high priestess, actually, in the movie. And what ends up happening is Achilles says, well, you know what? I'm not going to go to war anymore, Agamemnon, oh great Greek king. I'm not going to fight the Trojans for you anymore. I'm going to sit it out. Guess what happens to the Greek army as Achilles is sitting out?
Did they start becoming militant for something else? Did they start disbanding and maybe worshiping false gods or something like that?
I mean, they're all worshiping from a Christian point of view. From our point of view, they're all worshiping false gods.
Right.
But no, the army's losing.
Mm-hmm.
The army's failing.
Mm-hmm.
So Agamemnon's at a loss because he really, 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 really does not want to lose this war against Troy. What changes is Achilles' relative Patroclus puts on Achilles' armor, disguises himself, fights the Trojan hero Hector. Hector kills the boy, only realizes it's Achilles, not Achilles, after he takes off his armor, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Achilles is angry. Achilles is pissed. Patroclus is dead. Achilles re-enters the war, and he fights Hector. And what is the number one thing in the movie and in Homer's Iliad that Hector asks for? Fighting Achilles in this pagan, I think more of a historical memory, even more than a myth. Does he ask, please spare my life, please don't kill me? Does Hector say, I'm going to absolutely whoop you, I'm the greater warrior? What does he ask? In the ancient world, what you do with burial of bodies is important because it determines their role in the afterlife. In the conception of the Greco-Roman pagan world, the idea is your soul is ferried across the river Styx by Chiron, the ferryman, or in the movie they call him the boatman. I think it's kind of fun. And Hector says, offer me a honorable burial, please, if you kill me. And Achilles says wonderfully, this is a paraphrase, but it's a pretty close quote from the Iliad. There are no treaties between lions and men. Utterly, Achilles murders Hector, just destroys him in battle. He takes Hector's body, ties his body to a chariot, and drags that chariot around the city, humiliating the Trojan leader's corpse, thus saying he will forever remain kind of in a limbo in purgatory and a kind of place of liminal access. And here's where things get very Christian suddenly. How do you think things change? How do you think things resolve? Or do you remember from the movie? Because it's a very powerful scene, actually, with...
I think I might be confusing that film for another one, so please fill me in here.
The great actor Peter O'Toole plays Hector's father, Priam, king of Troy, Hector's dad, okay? He sneaks by enemy lines as the Trojan king, sneaks into Achilles' own camp, falls on his knees. He kisses the hand of Achilles, the man who murdered his own son, and pleads for the body. Achilles discovers in that moment that it's not in vengeance, it's not in hatred, it's not in an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth, that real heroism is found. Achilles in that moment rediscovers that in real heroism, is found in reconciliation. It's found in forgiveness.
Hmm.
And not a reconciliation and forgiveness that means that they're no longer going to be enemies in the morning. Oh, they're still going to be enemies in the morning. They're going to fight to the death again and again for another several long years. It's a 10-year-long siege before it ends. But even as enemies, there can be a kind of forgiveness that's there. Achilles gives back the body of Hector. They part with respect towards one another. And the next morning, Achilles dons his armor and they fight all over again.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a lot of echoes of Christmas there, actually.
Hmm.
I think the echoes of Christmas ultimately is we were like the Trojans and the Greeks, locked in mutually assured self-destruction. With the fall of Adam and of Eve, we, like Achilles, burned with anger over perceptions of injustice. We craved justice. We wanted justice. By the way, our culture now that demands social justice, often for very legitimate reasons, I may add, even as Achilles had legitimate reasons to be angry with the death of Patroclus, his close loved one. In light of that sense of justice, at least the ancient world ate itself to death like the serpent eating its own tail. And we become monsters. Friedrich Nietzsche said, words to the effect of, let those who contend with dragons beware, lest in contending with them they become dragons themselves. Achilles goes from becoming a dragon to becoming a man again with a heart. When he sees his enemy on his knees, the father figure, Priam. And Jesus is, of course, the image of the Father, Son of the Father. When we see Priam on his knees and offering a heartfelt plea, please allow me to bury my son so he can rest in peace. In the same way, our Lord Jesus Christ, the image of the Father, goes to the cross, pleading with the author of justice, being justice and mercy himself, turning to the Father, offering the sacrifice needed for our redemption. I'm using poetically imprecise language. I want to emphasize that. There are theologians who could correct me maybe on the nuance of the terms that I'm using here. But if those are willing to humor me a bit here, this is the reason why, Matt, you might be unfamiliar with his name. Most people in the West are. If you talk to an Orthodox, they might know. Basil, St. Basil, I believe Basil the Great, he writes a whole work on the education of young men in ancient pagan literature, particularly Homer, as a preparation to better understand the Bible. It's very relevant for today's culture that says, throw out Harry Potter, or throw out Lord of the Rings, or these days, throw out D&D, or whatever. Instead, Basil the Great, the early church says, yes, of course, there are exceptions. Tertullian is a major exception. He has a quite opposite view. But Basil believes that we should read other cultural sources and see in them the fingerprint of the storyteller telling these stories. Sub-creation, in the words of Tolkien. We create because we ourselves are created. We also need to remember the cross in the Christmas story. On other recording, I'm eager for us to post that too, about gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Myrrh, the embalming fluid, right? The idea of, the very idea of the words of Simeon telling to Mary, a sword will pierce your own heart also. The thoughts of many hearts might be revealed, right? So the idea of Our Lady of Sorrows, if you want to take the Roman Catholic image. So your question about myths is right on. It's just something that we as moderns, I think the modern church has become a bit of an amnesiac. Not the mystical bride, the church, the institution of the church. And I really should distinguish between those. Otherwise, I really will hear about it in the comment section for sure. You know.
So why do you think there is so much confusion about what makes Christ unique? Why is there so little appreciation for the historical evidence in both Roman records and archaeology, of other sources. Why are we why do we treat um, Christ's existence with a unique skepticism compared to Aristotle, for example, or other people who have scarce records or records that came much later after their death than those of Christ? Why are we debating Christ's existence at all? I do understand that that is a phenomena that might be decreasing to some degree. People like Richard Dawkins now are no longer, I might be mistaken, but I believe they're no longer arguing that Christ never existed, but are going about it with a different nuance rather than that absolute. What do you think is causing people to look at the birth of Christ as a work of mere myth and not a historical record?
Can I be really cheeky? Like really, really cheeky. Who did Aristotle claim to be?
I see. I see where you're going.
Yeah. He claimed to be a philosopher.
Mm-hmm.
I point to the truth. I'm not the truth. Socrates said, I know that I know nothing. Right? Plato pointed to the forms above. Even Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, for whom we have very, very few early sources at all. Right? I don't want people to mishear me. That doesn't mean he didn't exist. That doesn't mean we have no reliable data. What I'm saying is your sources are generally later than for Christianity. He said, look not to me, look to my teaching. You know, I have four noble truths. I have an eightfold path. Matt, whom did Jesus Christ claim to be?
Yeah, God incarnate. Right.
I am the way, the truth, and the life. And I think it's important to actually to go to quotations like that, because when we say God incarnate, you and I mean the one true God, the creator of heaven and of earth, of all things visible and invisible. When you say in the ancient world, God incarnate, they'd be like, yeah, of course. Yeah, Pharaoh is God incarnate.
Mm-hmm.
The emperor in Rome is the genius of the divine incarnate. What do you Christians mean by God?
Mm-hmm.
They come from the Jewish culture, a Jewish background. I say this with reverence to the people of Abraham, Isaac, and Yaakov. The ego eimi, the Yach, the I am that I am. Before Abraham was, Jesus says, I am. Or better yet, the title, the Son of Man. If you want to stick with Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The Son of Man in Daniel chapter 7 is the description of one who rides on the clouds, judges the souls of the righteous and of the unrighteous, and whom all people on earth worship. I believe in Greek is vatrao. I could be wrong about that. I took Hebrew for seminary instead of the Greek. But literally means to worship, not serve, or English translations have it wrong. Worship along with the Ancient of Days. There's the Trinity already in the Hebrew Bible. You have Father and you have Son, and of course you will have references to the Spirit elsewhere. So the idea that the Creator God, the Almighty God, the God of gods, decides to become not Conan the Barbarian, not Aragorn, not Maximus from Gladiator, not Leonidas, but instead chooses to become a refugee migrant boy in the arms of a mother shivering in the cold. By the way, another reason for December the 25th, I should have included this earlier, is that early date for March the 25th was floated, I believe, in the 2nd or 3rd centuries. It certainly was no later than by the 3rd century. March the 25th was floated around for the Annunciation. There was a belief that great men also died when they were born. March the 25th was also a date floated around for the crucifixion.
Easter time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So people thought that maybe he's conceived and dies about the same day. really interesting ideas were floated around.
Great men had good book covers.
But that is an ancient concept that was really floated. And by the way, I would love to do a podcast on this later. I would like to do more research on it. There is a purported relic of the crown of thorns.
Mm-hmm.
Once again, as a representative of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, this doesn't mean we bind the consciences of anyone to believe this. These are all private theological opinions. I add that caveat. But there is a relic purportedly of the crown of thorns, which bleeds on Good Friday whenever Good Friday aligns with March the 25th.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
I mean, to quote Signs, which you were quoting earlier, either we're talking about one of the most elaborate hoaxes ever concocted, or we're talking about something real. I'm going to be honest, I think we're talking about something very real.
What I love about that scene in that movie, by the way, in the movie Signs, directed by M. Night Shyamalan, a newscaster says that. Beautiful moment. It's hard to imagine. Anyhow.
Well, once again, who are the newscasters too, by the way, in the Christmas narrative? Okay, yes, you have the angels. And yes, you have the angels declaring the news to Mary, who, of course, is a woman on the far edges of the Roman Empire. Some say a peasant girl. I'd like to say she might have come from more means, but we can discuss that another time. But they also send the shepherds. In the ancient world, shepherds don't always have the most prestigious reputation. They're sleeping with the smelly sheep. They're not kings. They're not queens. They're not royalty. They're smelly shepherds. And yet they are the first to show up at the manger and fall on their faces before the one whom Luke calls, and whom the angels call in Greek, Kyrios, the Septuagint Greek translation of Adonai, the creator of the universe.
Mm-hmm.
I get so worked up about that because I'm very shortly to be called pastor. And some parish contexts that lean more high churchly, in light of my friend Father Wiki Barnes, even the title Father. And what the role of pastor really does point to is the idea of shepherding. Jesus says before he ascends into heaven, Matthew 28, make disciples of all nations, not pew sitters. Disciples means students. Make students of all nations. So the infant baby Jesus is giving us an entire lecture, a university lecture, without uttering more than crying in his mother's arms, without uttering a single word. St. Francis of Assisi has a quote apocryphally attributed to him, but one which is beautiful. Preach the gospel always and only sometimes use words.
Mm-hmm.
The word became flesh and dwells among us. We beheld his glory. The glory is of the Father, full of grace and truth. For the law came through Moses, but grace and truth have come by Jesus Christ. And yet, when the word becomes flesh, does he utter a single word initially? Does he appear in fire and smoke? No, he appears in a feeding trough. He appears surrounded by animals. Where else do we find animals in the Bible? The Garden of Eden and Noah's Ark, right? He re-Edenizes the world using ancient poetry of the people of Israel. So yeah, why do people, to go back to your question earlier, why do people not trust the New Testament, the Bible overall, and they trust all these other sources? If you were to accept this as true, if we as a world were to accept this as true, we can no longer rely on ourselves as gods, knowing both good and evil. We would have to break our idols to pieces. We'd have to fall on our faces. We'd have to declare that Jesus Christ is Lord. And the hysterical point I find is it's not a head issue. It's a heart issue. And with all heart issues, we should not expect as Christians, and this is a note to fellow Christians, we should not expect as Christians people to have a Saul to Paul experience right away. This is not the story of people overnight realizing who and what they are. We really are, and I know it's been overused and unfortunately a bit abused lately in terminology. But I have to use the analogy again from the Matrix. We are red pilling a little bit, people. But it's not into the reality of, okay, you're duped and you're a slave in the system. Yes, we're enslaved to original sin. That's true. The world, the flesh, and the very real devil, I might add. But it's waking to realize that God is Emmanuel, God with us. To realize that the hollowness, the emptiness we perceive in us can and will be filled by a love who is stooped from heaven's throne to hold us. Now, that's not just poetry. I've touched the rocks where it has happened. I have historically found the geography fitting, the archaeology fitting. Our YouTube channel is partly dedicated to that. Ken Dark, 2005, finds what may be the house of the Holy Family in Nazareth with glass beads that may have belonged to a spindle belonging to a woman living 2,000 years ago. That's the Holy Family's home. That's Mary. By the way, if she could afford that kind of material also too, it suggests that maybe her yes to God might have cost her comfortability financially in a lot of ways. I can't prove that, but it seems to lean in the direction that, well, maybe she went from maybe not being well off, but comfortable to being a refugee, being beloved in her community, to having people whisper, this Mary, I thought she was such a good girl. What was she doing shaming her father's name? To this day, and I am ashamed to say this, there are in interreligious dialogue in some circles people who will bring up the old gossip that we have preserved. I believe in Celsus, the interlocutor of Origen, the lie that Mary gives birth to Christ in an illicit relationship, or worse, actually, with a Roman centurion by the name of Pentera. All, by the way, well after the first century context. But we can imagine whispers like this, where Mary's name is dragged through the mud, and yet she chooses to follow the plan set out for her. John 8, the Pharisees say to Jesus, "We were not born to fornication. Where is your father?" Jesus says, "You neither know my Father nor me." And leads to him angrily calling them, "You are children of your father, the devil." And ends with, "Before Abraham was, I am." That whole passage, by the way, I think what gets Jesus so angry in that passage, as someone who holds to a very high view of Mary, in light of early church sources and the patristics, as Martin Luther did also, I think why did Jesus, I don't want to say lose his cool because he's God. What's irking him there? I think it was because the Pharisees were making insinuations against not only his own divine identity and origin, but also making insinuations against his mother. And yet, here's the greatest story ever told. God overcomes that by taking it all to himself on the tree. I mean, I've never read anything in antiquity or in our contemporary world where such mercy has touched it down. So the Christmas story and the cross, they can't be divided. I think it's something that we really, really, really miss. Just as we can't divide the manger from Noah's Ark or from the Garden of Eden, I would say that they're all intertwined in their own way, for sure. The poetry of ages. I'm just curious. I know you're probably going to wrap up soon, but as you've meditated on this, being Christmas pageants and the rest, I mean, I'm a newly married man. You've been a bit before me, in light of new Christmas traditions that are forming and our new families that are building. Do you ever catch yourself, man, just closing your eyes, remembering Christmas hymns, candlelight from years ago, looking up at maybe kids dressed in like sheets with plastic sticks pretending to be shepherds. Do you ever think of the magic of that? And I use magic in a Tolkienian way, the sense of the miraculous. Do you ever remember that and think to yourself, that's living on, that's continuing? Or do you feel a sense of wistfulness, like that seems to be fading? I'm an optimist lately. I think it's growing. And I've seen a lot of Jesus in this so-called secular world lately. But does your heart lean towards optimism? And do you ever have those visionary glimpses of the past? I know I'm a bit ancient in my young-mindedness.
Yeah. I'll keep this brief since I'm sure the cards in these cameras is going to run out soon, but I do feel a sense as I'm entering my 30th year on this planet, that there is a tradition here, the childlike experience of Christmas and the joy of that. That was something that was created by the older generations for me, for my childhood. Thank goodness. And I have a lot of positive and joyful associations with Christmas. So does my wife and her brother, my brother-in-law. I do feel like now, as I am in adulthood and am becoming more of an adult every day, also keeping that child alive, the inner child alive, I do feel like that feeling of Christmas is something that is now very much up to us, in part, to keep alive. The torch has somewhat been passed, and at least we're in the handoff phase between my parents' generation, my aunts and uncles, and me, in helping to plan and just ensure that even a gathering happens. I say that a little bit sad, but I also say that knowing that there is a responsibility in my participation in my family, you know?
Yeah.
I went to my brother-in-law's place last weekend. He lives in New Jersey with his wife. And I view them as being rather secular but really good people. And as soon as I entered their house, their place was decked out with Christmas decorations, blow-ups, lights, what have you. Tons of Santas everywhere. It was very funny. Much of this stuff was passed on from families who had moved and didn't want all that Christmas decoration to come with them. So they handed it off to their kids. And I just felt like I was walking into like my aunt or uncle's place, you know, with all that decoration. But right in the hallway as we entered was a beautiful creche. This scene of the manger of the nativity scene here. And it really reminded me of the creche that my parents have in its materials: old wood, bark, clay painted sculptures, animals with the wise men. And there's a little bit of nature in that scene, you know, moss on the roof and stuff like that. And I don't know, it's just, there's something earthy about it. There's something real about it, you know, and it's rough in its texture, but it's alive too. It's funny. And I see that scene in my local neighborhood in my town center. There is a nativity scene. There's two in my neighborhood. There are echoes everywhere of the magic of Christmas. And while some of that responsibility to keep that alive has been passed to me, and I stumble a little bit to keep it alive, you know, Christmas planning and present buying is tough.
Oh, I suck at it. I have yet to get yours, but anyway.
Yeah, right? Same.
Yeah.
You know, it's something that maintains its beauty as we stumble.
Yeah.
And if you're willing to be surprised, it's there for you.
Yeah.
We'll see how this continues as the years go on, but it is a hopeful scene. And there is melancholy to it.
I walked into the Palisades Mall, and at that beautiful mall, there was a shop dedicated to Christmas. And there, my wife, Sam, stops me with joy beaming through her. It's a beautiful image to close on. You have an image of Santa on one of the statues. And Santa is genuflecting, is literally prostrated before the infant baby Jesus.
That's cool.
And I turned to Sam as she described the scene to me. I'm like, the revolution has begun. And she turns to me, she's like, the revolution hasn't ended, John.
Well said.
You know, I'm like, all right. That's why she's a saint. But I'm
That's
like,
funny. What an image. Well, thank you, John.
yeah, dude, God bless, man. And a blessing to everybody who's tuning in, and to all of you, a blessed, beautiful conclusion to Adventus and the arrival of the Christ Mass, for sure. Amen.